Think of this presentation as an executive summary of the applied aspects of accessibility. The focus is mainly on HTML and Microsoft Word. These are the core principles that you need to keep in mind, and my intention is that by the end of it you'll understand enough of the concepts to be able to use the tools that will tell you whether or not your documents are accessible. So we begin, I'll just go to full screen here, with three different distinct standards of accessibility. The WAI, or the World Wide Web Accessibility Initiative, comes out of an organization called W3C. That stands for the World Wide Web Consortium, hence the W3. The W3 was formed early in the years of the internet, in the early 1990s. It is a worldwide organization based primarily on volunteer work, although there are paid people who do work with it. And these people set the established protocols and rules to try to standardize the internet. It's a very important function because without it, different companies like Microsoft browsers and Chrome browsers would be competing with each other, and there would be different standards for every kind of set of information on the internet, and that's ridiculous. It would be like having a different size gas nozzle at each gas company's outlets, and your car would only be able to take gas from one of them. So the WA, as part of the W3 consortium, is an international standard for accessibility. AOTA is a specific set of standards for Ontario only. It was derived many years after the WAI. There are some differences, as we'll see, between AOTA and WAI, but one of the differences between WAI and AOTA is that WAI is voluntary, whereas AOTA is legislative, and the punitive monetary penalties that people pay for not complying with this are significant, up to $100,000 a day in some corporations if they don't comply. If you are going to do business at all with any government agency, all your documents have to be AOTA compliant, otherwise they won't deal with you. The third standard here is 508 USA only. It's a very weak cousin to the other two. It was originally, also been around a long time, it was originally designed for as a bait and switch, I suppose, in order to persuade businesses to move to accessible websites, and the guidelines are pretty minimal and pretty loose. So those are the three standards. If you take a look at this diagram, you'll see that the main industry standard is WAI, and WAI overlaps with AOTA and 508, and AOTA and 508 and WAI kind of all overlap with each other. There is clearly an area here in the middle where all of the rules apply, but my advice to you is to begin with WAI because it is really the umbrella standard in all of this. So we'll take a look now at the Web Accessibility Initiative. Down here on the bottom left is a link to the website. You can go and read about it if you want at your leisure. So there are four core principles of accessibility: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And I've put links down here on the bottom that will help you connect to that for more information. Let's take a look at this. Perceivable means that the information on the interface, on the screen, regardless whether it's HTML or Microsoft Word or even PowerPoint, and the user interface components have to be presentable to users in ways that they can perceive. It can't be invisible to all of their senses, and here's what that means. It has to take into account the fact that people who access the interface might be blind, or legally blind, or partially blind. The difference between blind and legally blind is that when you're legally blind, you can still see things, but with not enough clarity to function. Or you can be totally blind, you can be deaf, you can have physical challenges such as not having any hands. You can have cognitive disabilities like attention deficit disorder or any of those things. And that whatever you have on your interface must be presentable to users in ways that they can perceive. So if you are a quote-unquote normal, full-sighted, full-hearing person, you can't assume that whoever's looking at your interface is the same kind of person. You have to begin from the premise that they may have some deficiencies that need to be addressed. Second, it has to be operable. That is to say, the interface components and navigation cannot require an interaction that the user is unable to perform. What does that mean? Well, it means that you have to assume that not everybody is going to be able to click a mouse to navigate in and around your document, that they may have to have some kind of pen or wand that they hold in their teeth, or there may be some other mechanism that they use to voice activation, for example, is another one. Windows, you can program your Windows or your Mac environment to respond to your voice, to do commands. The interface and elements within it have to be, as they say, negotiable by the user under any conditions. Number three, understandable. The content or operation, either one, so the content is the words on the page and the operation is the layout and the navigation, cannot be beyond the user's understanding. So my takeaway from this is it has to be, as I have here, context appropriate. You've got to make it appropriate for seniors, for kids, for blind people, for deaf people, for cognitively challenged people. The wording has to be appropriate as well, so that, and the font size has to be appropriate. And so these are the general principles from which the actual rules are going to emerge. These are the four pillars or cornerstones of how we think about accessibility. And finally, robust, meaning the content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents. What that means is, in terms of HTML, no matter what web browser you're using. And of course, one of the problems is that each web browser has a different screen size when you open it up to full screen. Each of them has a different square inch measurement of how much is displayable space, these sorts of things, and including assistive technologies, which basically means text to voice or voice to text technologies. And here's the most important thing: as technologies and user agents, which are web browsers, evolve, the content should remain accessible. You can't make it dependent on one version of one browser. It's got to be universal. You don't need to memorize these first principles of accessibility. The only reason I put them here is because they become the structural environment in which we place everything else. So all of the rules that I'm going to talk about now emerge from one of these four core principles. The first principle, and these are just some examples, is that the text has to be perceivable. So Rule 1.1 says you've got to provide text alternatives for non-text content. What does that mean? That means images, photographs, icons, video clips, movies, YouTube connections, any kind of multimedia content has to have text in there that describes what that video or what that audio is. Let's take, for example, a site where I want to put up a link to one of my band's songs on one of our CDs. Well, I can put a link to that song on the CD, but for somebody who is blind, they don't know that that's going to take me there. Or for somebody who is deaf, they might not be sure about what kind of music this is. So I have to provide text alternatives that would describe that song to somebody who is deaf, maybe describe the genre, what it sounds like, what the tempo is. Or for somebody who is blind, I have to provide information in the link that makes it clear to them that that's what that is. It's very important to do this, and I will make another video that will show how text-to-speech works, because all the text reader does is take the words on the page and read them. And if those words on the page don't make sense to somebody who can't see them and can only hear them, it's not going to work. Also here we have to be aware that any text on a page can be converted to large print, to braille, to speech, which means a synthesized voice, even to symbols or simpler language. Time-based media is any media that runs on the clock, so it's basically audio, video stuff. You need a text alternative for that. This is also important under perceivable. 1.3, create content that can be presented in different ways. For example, a simple layout. You might have to build two different solutions to the same layout, one for people who are sighted and one for people who are not. And finally, 1.4, make it easier for users to see and hear content, including separating foreground from background. And this is very important because the foreground is really the text, and the background, of course, is the background. So if you have a low contrast between the text and the background, say dark gray on light gray, a lot of people, not just people who are visually impaired, but seniors are going to have a hard time seeing that. You really need a high level of contrast to make the text clear to people who are sighted. And that's basically the highest way to go on that is black on white. So the first principle is perceivable, and under perceivable we have these other explanations. There's a link here that will take you to more if you want. The second principle is operable. This is expanded a bit more. You have to make all functionality available from a keyboard. Now what that means for most of us, it won't apply unless you are using a form that people fill out. So if you have a form, if you think about that, it's got multiple fields that you have to complete. You're going to have to figure out the order in which the cursor is going to move through the form. If you are sighted, you can move through the form by just looking at the fields that you want to fill out first and moving to the other ones after. If you are not sighted, you have to be able to use the tab key to move through the form. The coding for that is a little intricate, and I'm not aware of anything inside Microsoft Word that allows us to do that. But the functionality does have to be available, if possible, from a keyboard. You've got to provide users enough time to read and use content. So if you've created a slideshow or some kind of image on a screen that's going to disappear after a certain number of seconds, I'm thinking now of PowerPoint animations, you've got to provide users enough time to read and use the content. Do not design content in a way that is known to cause seizures. This is a very important rule. A lot of times people will come to a website and the first thing they'll see is an animation. That will or could trigger an epileptic seizure. So you don't want any unactivated motion, especially on a website, unless the user clicks on something to make it happen. So websites that you go to, as soon as you open it up, if there's an animation or a video that starts automatically, that is not accessible and will fail accessibility standards. And finally, 2.4, provide users ways to help users navigate, find content, and determine where they are. This is usually a navigation menu in HTML, Microsoft Word. It could be a table of contents or a navigation panel on the left-hand side. But you basically have to be able to permit your users to move through your document in any way that they want. We call this ergodic text, and that means that the user is in control of how they move through the document. You don't want to force them to read page 1 and then page 2 and then page 3 and not let them move around. You wouldn't have that restriction if you had a book in your hand, because you could simply go to the table of contents, find the topic that you want, and flip down later to what you needed. Third principle, understandable. Sounds really basic, but you know, if the language, the text in your interface isn't readable and understandable to your audience, you're going to have to change it. For people working in Microsoft Word, this basically means that the readability level the grade level needed to understand or comprehend this prose has to be reduced or upgraded to be compatible with whatever level of education and reading expertise your intended audience has. 3.2, make your web pages appear operable in predictable ways. That's a reference to hyperlinks. So for example, by default, hyperlinks are blue and underlined, as you can see here. You do have the capability in both Word and for tooltips and in HTML for hyperlinks, you do have the ability to change the color and the text decoration of a hyperlink. So you could make hyperlinks all red and italic and no underlined. But the problem is that that isn't a predictable navigation way, and users won't know that until they actually mouse over it. So you know what, if it's a standard way of doing things, don't mess with it unless you really have to for creative reasons. Number 3.3, help users avoid and correct mistakes. This is affordance. If they click on something that takes them to a wrong page, they need to be able to click back. There are also other navigational tools you can use, something called breadcrumbs. You can go to YouTube and look it up. A breadcrumb is the pathway of directories and files that you clicked on to get from point A to point F. And breadcrumbs allow you to retrace your step in any number of ways. Quite easy to do in HTML, a lot more difficult to do in Microsoft Word. And finally, the fourth principle, maximize the compatibility with current and future user agents using assistive technologies. This is much harder to do. This picture on the top right here is the god Janus. He looks backwards in time and forwards to the future, hence the term January, or the month January. But I put this in because it's very difficult to anticipate what kinds of assistive technologies are going to appear in the future. We know, for example, assistive technologies might be things like braille readers or voice activation devices and so on. We want to try to code or to make our documents with an eye to future considerations. If you can't, you can't, but that's the idea. Now, those are the principles. There are three levels of conformity or conformance that you can apply to. Obviously, you want to do ideally priority one. That has to be. Web content developers must satisfy this checkpoint. So if you see a priority one, you're going to see up here in the top left, it's urgent and important. These are the things that you must do. So for example, alternative text to an image is a priority one. You just have to do it. It's the minimum required. Whether or not you annotate an image in a lot of detail or not is not really necessary to do. Like, how many words do you need to describe a painting? Do you want to get into all of the details about the color and the foreground and the background and all of this stuff, or do you just want broad strokes of the brush? So the idea in these three priorities as you move through them, the most basic requirement is priority one. You've got to do that. Priority two is everything that you should do to satisfy the requirement. And priority three is even more stringent, everything that may address this point. And I know it says content developers here. That really means HTML coders or Microsoft Word authors. But the whole system and the tools that will tell you this will automatically tell you whether your level of conformity is a priority one, a priority, or a priority one, priority two, or priority three. If, as you'll see, when you run your document through a validator, it may say you've only got a priority two, and it will tell you very specifically what you need to do to change the content of your interface, of your document, to get up to priority three. So I don't want you to worry like, well, how am I going to know what I have to do to get from priority two to priority three? They will tell you. All you need to understand is priority one is the minimum, priority three is the maximum, Priority 2 is somewhere in the middle. And Trust the System will tell you what you have to decide is what level of priority of conformance do you want to code to. Do you want a 1, a 2, or a 3? Ideally, we all want to be 3, but we may not be able to do that because of limitations of the software in Microsoft Word, because our client, if you're an HTML web designer, the client doesn't want something in there that may override the web accessibility initiative. Then you've got to sort of give way to that. So the 3 levels of conformity: priority 1 or level A, all the checkpoints are satisfied. Conformity level AA or 2, priority 1 and 2 are satisfied, and conformance level AAA 1, 2, and 3 are satisfied. So just to go back, here's your priorities 1, 2, or 3. If you've only got priority 1 checked, you're level A. If you've got 1 and 2 satisfied, you're AA. If you've got 1, 2, and 3 satisfied, you're AAA. These are little logos here that you can put on if you're a web designer, or even in Microsoft Word, you can put it in there. You don't need to. It's just a kind of way to brag that you meet AAA conformity, which means that you've got all priorities 1, 2, and 3. All right. This is a website I'm going to take you to. It's called the Quick Reference, and you can see here I've got the URL at the bottom of the Microsoft or of the PowerPoint file, but you can just go to Google and type in how to meet the WCAG Quick Reference, and it will take you to this site. So I want to take you to that site right now. And we'll just take a quick look at it. So it's a very cool site. Right now you see that there's a banner across the top, there's a column on the left hand side. This is your table of contents. Oops, stop that. And you have some options. Sorry, clear all filters. You have some options on the left hand side here. You can hide this if you wish. You can show it. You can filter in or out certain things. For example, look at this, the level. So if you want only level A, which is priority 1, or level AA, which is all priority 1 and 2, or triple priority, double AAA, which is priorities 1, 2, and 3, you can select or deselect that. This is all for HTML code. I don't want you to worry about this. Area is for JavaScript coding. Don't worry about that. But we're not going to use any filters. We're just going to go back here, and I'll just give you an example of how this works. So these are my 4 areas. Remember, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So those 4 main areas that I talked to you about all appear here in the Quick Reference Guide. I want to say, what do I do with non-text content? So that means images, videos, audio, media of any kind. What do I do with it? And it gives you some a rule here first. Let's hide the full description. All non-text content that is presented to the user has an alternative text that serves the equivalent purpose except for the situations below. I'm saying, okay, well, what does that, I don't know what that means. Over here on the right, understanding 1.1.1, and when you click on that, it explains that in detail. It tells you what time-based media is, what input controls are, what decoration and formatting and invisibility is. So it's going to explain all of those things to you if you are having trouble understanding it. This is only for your comprehension. The thing is, when you get to using the tools are not going to explain this to you. They're just going to tell you what to do. So I suppose from the point of view of shallow learning, where you really don't need to know anything except to be a kind of mindless automaton that does what the validator tells you to, you can certainly go that route. and just do what the damn validator tells you to. The problem is that in some cases, if you don't understand conceptually what you are doing, you're going to have a hard time implementing it in your document. And so the reason I put the quick reference guide here is that I'm going to suggest that for the most part you let the tools do the decision making for you. And if you're not clear, the validation tools will often have a brief explanation, and if that is not enough, then come here to the quick reference guide. So you can see here, for example, live audio. There are some guidelines here for what you have to do. Here it says create content that can be presented in different ways. If you need to understand more of it, you can do all of that. So this reference guide here just allows you to look up different rules and see how they work. One word of caution, I've been working with this stuff for many years now. Sometimes the quick reference guide is immensely helpful, and you will get there and you will say, oh my God, thankfully I've got this tool and it made it all clear. In other cases, you will find yourself, no doubt, clicking in circles. It's kind of like being lost in a forest where you keep coming past the same spot again. It really it can get you messed up and going in circles, at which point you should just walk away. I just noticed here a couple of things here. While I'm at it, I just may as well draw your attention to the use of color. Talks about the color ratio of bright colors in the foreground and bright colors in the background. I will talk about that in a separate area, separate video. This one is interesting, images of a text. And I say this because a lot of times, especially in websites, but it can happen in Word as well, you can take, let's say you take the York logo. Let's just go to the York site for a minute. And this looks like text. It says York. But if I right click on it, it says View Image. And there is no text there. That is an image of the letters YORKU and University. And so what this is saying, is if you're going to use an image of a text, you have to have some way to describe what that image is saying. Otherwise, somebody who is blind is not going to be able to know that. So there is your quick reference guide. Now let me go back here to my PowerPoint. This is where we left off. All right, a few main points about validation and we're done. HTML and all its related languages. Why is that so stupid? Sorry, that's my bad. This is primarily for HTML. It doesn't apply as much as it does to Word as it does to HTML. But the testing tools that I will give you separately are limited. And you may get puzzling errors that don't make any sense. In the case of HTML, for example, our new HTML standard is HTML5. It replaced HTML4. It's only a matter of time before we move from HTML5 to HTML6. What happened was when we transitioned from 4 to 5, all of the validators were programmed to look at code that was only allowed in HTML4. When HTML5 came along and it was newly approved, there were a lot of new tags, HTML tags in there that didn't exist before. And because the validators hadn't been updated yet to meet the new HTML5 standard, they would look at new code by the HTML4 standard and see errors and say, okay, you know what, this is going to fail accessibility and fail validation because I don't recognize those tags. The problem was not in the code, but in the fact that the validating tool had not been brought up to date. There's another issue. Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, and Excel have some built-in tools to assist, but it's a much more difficult prospect to make these documents accessible than it is to make HTML files accessible. That's because we don't have as much flexibility in the interface. Watch for that to change in new versions of Microsoft Word as they come out. PDFs, I'm only mentioning it here, are even harder to work with, way out of scope for us in this context. I'm not going to worry about it. Finally, two important points. When we turn our attention to the validating tools, conformity happens in two ways. The first way is what I call hard or non-negotiable. It's either there or not there and easily verifiable by the machine applications. So for example, you have to provide an alt text for images, audio, and media. So just let me take a moment here. If I am coding in HTML and I'm going to say IMG. I'll make this bigger in a minute. I think let's go full screen mode. No, that's still. So, oh yeah. Okay, so you can see this. So image SRC, I've got my image here called picture.jpg. That is going to fail accessibility because it does not have an alternative or caption to the image. Microsoft Word has the equivalent for an alternative text. IMG is the tag, SRC is the attribute, the value is always inside quotes. I have to use something called the alt attribute. I have a choice. Attributes can go anywhere inside. I could put it here, or if I don't want it there, I could put it here at the end. Doesn't matter. I have to say alt equals, and I can say picture of Niagara Falls. When I say hard-coded, the validators are going to look. If they don't see alt, as far as they're concerned, you haven't made it accessible. It's black and white, yes or no. The tag is either there or it is not. So that is what I call hard code. There is, by the way, if your description of a picture, for example, is going to be more than 250 characters, and you want a really long description, you can replace this by LONGDESC, by long description, which then would allow you to have many more words. But you get the idea that essentially conformity, it's either there or not for machines to determine. Soft, like a bunny, soft or negotiable conformity points are not detectable by computer, by machine, but need a human being to look and make a decision. That's why I say it requires human intervention and judgment. So, for example, I took a rule here, 3.1.3, unusual words. If you want to get AAA conformity, that is to say, you're complying with priority 1, priority 2, and priority 3. Look at how this is phrased. In your interface, Word, HTML, PowerPoint, it doesn't matter. A mechanism has to be made available for identifying specific definitions of words or phrases used in an unusual or restricted way, including idioms and jargon. This is human cognition. So for example, I don't know if I want to use slang and I want to say something, I really like something because it's really nice, and I have in my text, oh, that's really fly, or that's really dope. That is idiomatic English that needs to be explained in order to meet AAA conformity, because it would be an unusual word in an unusual context or meaning. And therefore, in order to make it comply, I have to make sure that that word has a definition somewhere on the page. So as I say here, there's no way for a machine to know this. A human being has to read the text and decide. That's a soft determination for validation. And sometimes when you use the tools, one of the things that will happen is that the tool itself may give you a hint about this, but it may not. And so just be aware that this is the second kind of level of conformity that you're going to have, and you may actually have to rely on your own human judgment to make sure that you've done that. Okay.